Welcome the tapestry of Piney Grove. J.W. Wallace. Welcome the tapestry of Piney Grove. In Piney Grove, community isn't built on a blueprint. It is woven by hand. The town operates in a series of concentric circles, where every local institution serves as a loom, passing the same colorful, stubborn threads back and forth until a safety net forms that no one can truly fall through. The morning loom, Jack's Diner. The day always begins at Jack's Diner, the undisputed town square under a cloud of bacon grease. Jack's is the community's central switchboard. Here, the Friday morning breakfast crew handles the town's immediate logistics. It's where Nelson from the one-shop stop drops off a bulk box of hardware tacks he bought at a steal, and where Billy Ray Huggins mentions that Mrs. Boggins's azaleas are looking dry. Before the coffee pot is empty, the daily news has been analyzed, parsed, and assigned to a committee. The spiritual anchor, Piney Grove Church. From Jack's, the thread stretches directly across the highway to Piney Grove Church. The church provides the moral and emotional gravity for the valley. When Pastor Cone stands at the pulpit, reading glasses secured by a braided black cord, he isn't just preaching to a congregation. He is speaking to the people who run the town. The tithes collected in the brass plates on Sunday morning are the exact funds used on Monday to widen a cemetery gate or patch a roof. The church is where the town processes its grief, celebrates its survival, and hums the hymns that bind them together. The heartbeat of history, Piney Grove Nursing Home. Down the road sits the Piney Grove Nursing Home, which functions as the town's living library. The nursing home isn't isolated from the community. It is deeply embedded in it. The school choir visits at Christmas, the church provides the Sunday afternoon chapel services, and Hubcap, the oversized grief dog from the neighboring funeral home, wanders the linoleum hallways, bridging the gap between life and what comes next. The nursing home is where the town's overlapping histories reside. When a resident like Miss Bernice breaks months of silence to crack a joke, the entire town hears about it by lunchtime at Jack's. It is a constant reminder to the younger generations of where Piney Grove came from. The future thread, the school. The local school is where the town's future is forged, but it relies entirely on the older institutions to keep it anchored. The business owners support the school at Jack's, who sponsor the baseball team, the church ladies who pack weekend snack bags for kids in need, and the grandparents at the nursing home, who proudly display finger-painted artwork on their small bulletin boards. The school teaches the kids the curriculum, but the town teaches them the culture, ensuring that when they grow up, they know exactly how to measure a gate before buying a mower. The local commerce, the one-shop stop. Tying the town's physical needs together is Nelson's one-stop shop. Nelson's philosophy, that you make your money when you buy an item, not when you sell it, applies to the whole town's survival. Piney Grove survives because it invests early in its people. By buying into each other's lives through neighborhood watchfulness, small-town grace, and shared laughter, the cost of living through a bad crop year or a family loss is drastically reduced. The invisible thread. If you pull on a single thread in Piney Grove, the whole fabric moves. A mechanical blunder by Pastor Cone becomes a bestseller at the one-shop stop. A dropped sandwich at the nursing home becomes a theological debate on dog discernment at Jack's. It is an ecosystem of faith, gossip, grocery discounts, and deep-seated affection. No institution stands alone because the people who sit in the pews are the same people who flip the burgers, teach the classrooms, comfort the grieving, and keep the old blue Ford trucks running on a prayer. The Piney Grove Church. If the Lord ever needed to locate Piney Grove, Alabama, he could find it by following the smell of fried chicken and hearing the sound of church committees arguing. The Piney Grove Church sat atop red clay hill, beneath a grove of towering pines planted by long-forgotten saints and watered by generations of gossip. The white frame building had survived storms, 2 renovations, 1 split over hymn books, and the Great Carpet Controversy of 1987. Its steeple pointed to heavenward. Its people pointed at one another. And for 40 years, Reverend Cone had managed to keep them all headed, mostly in the same direction. Now he is retiring. That news hit Piney Grove harder than a tornado warning. Reverend Cohn had baptized babies, buried grandparents, married sweethearts, and preached nearly 3,000 sermons. Folks couldn't remember a time when he hadn't stood behind the pulpit. On his last Sunday, every pew was filled. People lined up the walls. Even members who hadn't attended in years appeared, suddenly remembering where the church was located. Reverend Cohn smiled. "My dear friends," he said, "the Lord had a church before I arrived, and he'll have one after I'm gone." That sounded noble. That started a war. Not a real war, a church war. This is considerably more dangerous because nobody raises their voice. They smile as they talk about one another in the parking lot. By Tuesday, Piney Grove had divided into camps. Some wanted a young pastor. Others wanted an older pastor. Some wanted a preacher with a doctorate. Others wanted somebody who knew regular folks. Miss Lula Mae Jenkins favored whoever preached shorter sermons. Billy Ray Possum Tucker said he preferred a man who knew the difference between a carburetor and a catalytic converter. Meanwhile, Deacon Buck Mercer remained calm. Buck had served Piney Grove so long that nobody remembered when he started. He was built like a feed store and smiled like a man who had survived every church disagreement since Noah complained about seating on the ark. Buck's favorite saying was, "Never met a problem that couldn't be solved by prayer, pie, or a church committee," though folks noticed he usually listed prayer first and committees last. One Wednesday evening, the pastor search committee held its first meeting. There were 12 members, which meant there were 15 opinions. Brother Horace declared they needed someone with vision. Miss Ruby wanted somebody who wore a tie. Sister Mildred insisted facial hair was a sign of rebellion. "Jesus had a beard," Billy Ray whispered. Goober barked in agreement from beneath the table. Nobody listened. By the third meeting, things had become more dramatic than county politics. People quoted scripture to support their favorite candidates. Old disagreements resurfaced. One member brought up an incident from Vacation Bible School in 1994. Another reminded everyone who had voted against replacing the fellowship hall freezer. Through it all, Deacon Buck chewed pecans and prayed. But while everyone was arguing over who would become the next pastor, another mystery quietly emerged. Every Sunday morning, without fail, the offering plates contained an envelope. No name, no return address, no note, just cash. Always exactly $1,000. The counters noticed first, then the finance committee, then the treasurer, finally the deacons. Reverend Cohn knew about it, but he told no one. "Maybe somebody just wants to help," he said. "But who?" they asked. Reverend Cohn smiled. "If the Lord knows, that's enough for me." But Piney Grove wasn't satisfied. Nothing stirs curiosity like anonymous money. Miss Lula Mae had theories. Billy Ray had theories. Sheriff Wade Harper had theories. Even Hubcap, Piney Grove Funeral Home's grief dog, seemed interested, though nobody knew why. The mystery spread. Some believed it was an angel. Others suspected a wealthy businessman. Miss Ruby thought it might be the Methodists trying to buy influence. Nobody ruled out aliens. Meanwhile, another envelope appeared every Sunday, always anonymous, always in the same offering plate, and always containing exactly $1,000. As autumn settled over Piney Grove, Reverend Cohn sat alone in his office beneath photographs of weddings, baptisms, and mission trips. 40 years, thousands of sermons, countless prayers. He smiled at the old church. Churches he knew had always been made up of sinners learning grace. Pride sometimes gets in the way. So did stubbornness. So did church committees. Yet somehow, by the mercy of God, love usually won. Outside his window, laughter drifted from the fellowship hall. Wednesday night supper had begun with chicken and dumplings, sweet tea, pie, and enough opinions to fill the state legislature. Reverend Cohn chuckled. "Lord," he whispered, "they'll be just fine." He paused. "Though you might want to help the next preacher." And somewhere deep in Piney Grove, among the righteous and the unrighteous, someone quietly prepared another anonymous envelope and smiled. The pine rafters of the Piney Grove Church held 80 years of trapped heat, 3 generations of wood smoke, and the restless spirits of a dozen summer revivals. By the third night of the August awakening, The air inside the sanctuary was thick enough to chew, smelling of peppermint, sweat, and damp hymnals. Evelyn Vance, the choir director, stood at the front of the choir loft, waving a cardboard funeral home fan in one hand and her conducting baton in the other. She was caught in a crossfire. To her right sat the traditionalists, led by an unyielding row of elders who believed any song written after 1954 was a slippery slope to perdition. To her left sat the younger generation, including a couple of teenagers who worked the late shift down at Jack's, who were practically begging to introduce an acoustic guitar to the evening service. "We are doing page 142, The Old Rugged Cross," Evelyn whispered firmly, her eyes darting between the two factions as the congregation began to file into the pews. "No drums, no amplifiers. But," she added, pointing a warning finger at the elders, "we are singing it at a tempo that does not make it sound like a funeral march. We are alive, and we are going to act like it." While Evelyn managed the delicate politics of the choir loft, Ben, the church's lone handyman, was sweating through his work shirt in the small, cramped utility closet directly behind the altar. A persistent rattle in the church's ancient ventilation system had tracked him down to a hollow section of the tongue and groove paneling. With a crowbar and a prayer, Ben pried back a stubborn strip of oak. The wood gave way with a dry, splintering groan. But what lay behind it wasn't a loose duct. It was a shallow, dust-covered recess built into the very framing of the altar. Inside rested an old, rusted metal tobacco tin. Ben wiped his brow with the back of his hand, kneeling under the low-wattage bulb. He popped the tin's lid. Inside was a stack of unmailed letters, their envelopes yellowed like corn husks, tied together with a piece of frayed butcher's twine. The handwriting on the top envelope was an elegant, faded cursive, dated July 1958. Curiosity overriding decorum, Ben carefully slid the first letter from its casing as the organ's opening chords vibrated through the floorboards beneath him. "My dearest Martha," the letter began, "they are sending me out to the county line by the end of the week, and your daddy won't let me walk through the front gate. But I am leaving this where I know you'll find it, behind the third pew where you sing every Sunday morning. If you still want the future we talked about under the porch light, meet me at the schoolhouse steps after the final revival service. I'll keep the engine running." It was signed, Daniel. Ben sat back against the dusty studs, the breath leaving him. Martha and Daniel, Grana and Pappy. The entire town now knew them as the eccentric, sharp-witted fixtures of the Piney Grove nursing home. The two who had recently caused a minor scandal by escaping to Jack's drive-thru in the middle of the night. But nobody living knew that 68 years ago, a hidden letter left in the house of God had missed its mark, altering the geometry of two lives forever. Pappy must have hidden it, and a well-meaning deacon cleaning the pews decades ago must have swept it into the altar storage, thinking it was old church scrap. Out in the sanctuary, the choir finally erupted into song. The traditionalists sang with booming, practiced precision, while the younger kids added a syncopated, soulful harmony that Evelyn managed to blend into a single voice through sheer force of will. For a moment, the friction dissolved, and the rafters echoed with a unified, beautiful sound that seemed to bridge the gap between what the town was and what it was becoming. Ben stepped out of the utility closet, the tin tucked securely under his arm. He stood at the back of the sweltering church, watching Evelyn lead the congregation, his eyes fixed on the space in the third pew where a young girl had once sat, waiting for a sign that never came. The revival would end tonight, but Ben knew his work wasn't done. The mechanics of faith were fine for Sunday morning, but tomorrow he was going to take a walk down to the nursing home to deliver a piece of the past that had been waiting in the dark for far too long. The baptismal plunge. Of course, the sanctuary wasn't always a place of lingering romance and beautifully blended harmonies. More often than not, it was a stage for the unpredictable laws of small-town physics. Every pastor who ever stepped behind the Piney Grove pulpit knew that while the baptismal waters promised profound spiritual renewal, the actual execution required a keen sense of balance. Take the Sunday morning right after that revival season. We had a wonderful young woman, a former Catholic of Mexican heritage, who had recently joined the church. She was about 30, deeply devout, and ready to take the step of believer's baptism. To help her prepare for the big day, we enlisted the aid of one of our most saintly, godly, and fiercely dedicated Sunday school teachers. There was only one minor complication. The dear sister's eyesight wasn't quite what it used to be. Before the service started, I was sitting in the men's dressing room on one side of the baptistry, mentally reviewing my sermon notes and hauling on my heavy, lead-lined baptismal robes. A deacon was there with me, keeping things properly solemn. On the other side of the tank, the sweet Sunday school teacher and my wife were helping our baptismal candidate change into her white robes. Suddenly, the holy silence of the sanctuary was shattered by a sound that absolutely did not belong in a church house. It wasn't a gentle ripple or a joyful noise. It sounded exactly like a startled alligator thrashing around in an Okefenokee swamp. There was a violent commotion of splashing, frantic gasping, and the unmistakable sound of heavy, wet fabric slapping against the plastic lining of the tank. I threw the dressing room door open really quickly. Because the privacy curtains hadn't been pulled yet, the entire congregation out in the pews had a front row seat to the unfolding drama. Our visually impaired Sunday school teacher had missed the edge of the dressing area entirely. She had marched right down the steps, completely unaware of where the linoleum ended and the sacred waters began, and plunged headfirst into the pool. Now, if she had stood up, the water probably wouldn't have been much past her waist. But panic is a powerful thing, and she was entirely tangled up in her Sunday best. I declare, I think the poor woman would have drowned right there in the sanctuary if I hadn't jumped straight into the pool, fully robed, to haul her out. The biggest anchor keeping her down wasn't the wet dress, it was her pocketbook. I later heard from the deacons that her pocketbook was seen floating like a life preserver, but it was still firmly strapped to her arm, acting more like a concrete block. God only knows what she had packed in that purse, but it was heavy enough to keep her grounded. To make matters worse, the absolute funniest sight was the sweet lady's wig, which had parted ways with her head and was now floating serenely on top of the water like a patch of river moss. We managed to fish her out, dripping wet and gasping, while the congregation sat in stunned, wide-eyed silence. My wife quickly rushed over with a mountain of towels to usher our dear bald teacher back to safety. Despite the wet chaos, we dried off the platform, regained our composure, and proceeded with the service. Our candidate was baptized without further incident, emerging from the waters with grace. The real kicker, though, came in the dressing room. Our new member, still viewing the world through the lens of her traditional Catholic upbringing, turned to my wife with pure, unadulterated relief. She took a deep breath, shook her head, and whispered, "Oh, I just don't know what we would have done if the priest hadn't come to help us." I've been called a lot of things in my years at Piney Grove Church, but being credited as a life-saving priest by a wet, confused, and grateful new believer remains the highest honor of my mid-60s tenure. The final secret of Piney Grove Church. But if the baptistry was a place where hidden things floated to the top, the altar was where secrets went to be buried. There are moments from the pulpit when a preacher becomes a sole witness to a hidden piece of human drama. You are elevated on the platform, looking down at the congregation, possessing an angle on things that no one else in the pews can see. While most of my strangest memories belong directly to the soil of Piney Grove, one particular funeral mystery followed me from a temporary service down in Foley. A woman from the community had passed away. She left behind an ex-husband and two grown sons, and the tension in the family air during the arrangements was thick enough to cut with a knife. Before the service began, one of the sons approached me with a specific, earnest request. He wanted to be the absolute last person to see his mother before the casket was closed for good. In those days, it was tradition to close the casket right there in front of the church sanctuary, never to be opened again. "I don't think there will be any problem with that at all," I told him, nodding. I went over to the funeral director, relayed the family's wish, and we set the order of service accordingly. The service proceeded with its usual solemn dignity. The hymns were sung, the scriptures were read, and the congregation filed past to pay their final respects. Finally, the sanctuary grew quiet. The crowd took their seats, and the son stepped forward to the front of the church for his final goodbye. I was seated on the stage, positioned at a precise angle, looking directly down into the open casket. I was the only person in the entire building who had this exact line of sight. What happened next took less than 5 seconds, but it stayed with me for decades. The son leaned in close, bending over his mother's body as if to whisper a final, private word or offer a parting kiss. As he did, his hand slipped into his coat pocket. With a swift, practiced motion, he withdrew a small object. He didn't place it in her hands or on her chest, where everyone might notice. Instead, he slid his hand along the interior of the casket, tucking the object almost entirely beneath her body, hiding it securely beneath the satin folds. He smoothly pulled his hand back, lingered for just a second longer as if finishing a prayer, and then turned and walked calmly back to his pew. The funeral director, Butch Hampton, stepped forward, rolled the heavy lid closed, and latched it shut. Whatever that boy had slipped into the casket was sealed away from the world forever. To this day, I have absolutely no idea what it was. Was it a hidden letter containing an apology he couldn't say out loud? A piece of jewelry from a happier time before the divorce? Or perhaps something tied to a family secret that the rest of the clan was never supposed to find? In a small-town ministry, you quickly learn that people carry burdens and secrets straight to the graveyard. Sometimes, as a preacher, your only job is to watch the lid close, keep your mouth shut, and let the earth hold the mysteries we aren't meant to solve. The Burns urn. Of course, funeral directors don't always get to close the lid on a mystery without a bit of confusion first. Sometimes the mystery sits right on top of the altar for everyone to see. Nearby Sand Mountain, Alabama, once gave Piney Grove a run for its money in that department during a combined church financial crusade. We were running a massive development campaign to raise capital to expand our facilities, and the entire congregation was asked to pitch in however they could. One exceptionally talented lady in the church decided to use her spiritual gifts in the ceramic arts. She spent weeks at her kiln crafting a massive, beautiful, and incredibly ornate ceramic container to serve as the official repository for the congregation's pledge cards. To give it that proper official title for our fundraising drive, she carefully painted 3 large, elegant letters right across the front. TWB, standing, of course, for Together We Build. It was a masterpiece. The only problem was that language is a slippery thing, and timing is everything. Right in the middle of our high-energy financial campaign, the church community was saddened by the passing of one of our longtime members. He was a beloved fellow, well known in town, and his name just happened to be Tommy W. Burns. The afternoon of the funeral, the local funeral director arrived early to transform the sanctuary into a space of solemn mourning. He began arranging the massive, overflowing floral tributes sent by grieving relatives and local businesses. The gladiolus, the carnations, the standing wreaths. As he was surveying the altar, his eyes fell upon the magnificent, pristine ceramic vessel sitting proudly at the center of the stage, bearing the bold, unmistakable inscription, TWB. The pieces clicked together perfectly in the funeral director's mind, Tommy W. Burns. Wanting to honor the family's apparent custom, he carefully adjusted the surrounding palms, polished the ceramic finish, and left the vessel sitting right there on the altar, front and center among the funeral sprays. Throughout the entire service, the congregation sat in the pews, staring at the altar. Half of them were weeping for old Tommy, and the other half were staring at the Together We Build campaign urn, wondering if the Burns family had suddenly gone into the high-end pottery business, or if Tommy had requested a very literal, very public resting place. I stood at the pulpit, looking out at the crowd, trying my absolute best to keep a straight face while preaching the eulogy with a giant, misidentified fundraising bucket looming directly behind me. Once the service concluded and the family had filed out toward the graveyard, the funeral director adjusted his jacket and walked up the altar steps to meet me. He looked at the massive ceramic piece, looked at me, and scratched his head. "Preacher," he whispered, dead serious, "were people supposed to put love gifts in the urn for the family? Or is Tommy already in there?" I closed my eyes, breathed a quick prayer for patience, and explained the difference between a building fund and a final resting place. To this day, whenever a church starts a fundraising campaign, I highly recommend they spell out the whole title, because you never know when a Burns might take flight. The Great Awakening of Lizzie May. The confusion over whether someone was actually inside the casket or just nearby, wasn't unique to Alabama, though. Long before I ever settled into the regular rhythms of Piney Grove, my seminary years took me up into the hills of Kentucky, where church traditions were deep, and the family reactions to grief were entirely unpredictable. I was serving a small country church out there when a member's brother passed away. The man had lived up north in Dayton, Ohio, but the family brought him back home to a neighboring sanctuary near Harrodsburg, Kentucky, to bury him. When the extended family piled out of their cars and into the pews, it became immediately obvious that they didn't spend much time under a church roof. They paced the aisles, fidgeted with their collars, and possessed the frantic, uneasy energy of folks who weren't entirely sure of the local etiquette. In those days, it was still customary to open the casket at the front of the sanctuary right before the service practice. I must say I am profoundly glad we have mostly moved away from that. The service was highly charged and deeply emotional. When the time came for the final viewing, the deceased's grown daughter walked up to the casket, weeping heavily. She managed to pay her respects, but the emotional weight was too much for her constitution. As she turned to head back to her seat in the very front row of the inside aisle, she suffered what the old-timers used to call a swoon. She didn't drop flat to the floor in a dead faint. Instead, the moment her backside hit the pew, her neck went entirely limp. Her head fell back, her arms went slack, and she slid down into the bench like a block of warm butter. The front row went completely silent as everyone stared at her, frozen in panic. The paralysis didn't last long. Directly across the aisle, sitting in the second row, was an older matriarch of the family who apparently had very little patience for theatrical health crises in the house of the Lord. This woman didn't rush over with smelling salts. She didn't look for a doctor. Instead, she stood straight up, pointed a rigid finger across the aisle, and shattered the solemnity of the sanctuary with a voice like a foghorn. Lizzie May, get up from there. Lizzie May, get up. It wasn't a plea, it was a military command. And wouldn't you know it? The sheer authority in that woman's voice must have bypassed Lizzie May's central nervous system. The slackness vanished, her eyes snapped open, and she immediately sat up straight as a board, completely cured of her affliction by the terror of a family elder. Every country preacher accumulates a mental list of things they never expected to handle from the pulpit. Witnessing a miraculous, loud-volume resurrection from a front-row swoon certainly ranks near the top of my Kentucky memories. But it did teach me early on that a pastor has to be ready to police just about anything in the sanctuary. Over the decades, I've had to navigate all sorts of eccentricities, including having to gently but firmly stop police officers and military personnel at the vestibule doors to say, "Guns are for the world outside, brothers. We don't bring iron into the sanctuary." Whether it's keeping the peace, keeping weapons out of the pews, or helping Lizzie May find her footing, a small-town preacher learns quickly. You can't always predict how the spirit or the family will move. Of open graves and honest eulogies. That layout of a country sanctuary, where the front row sits a mere 2 feet from the altar and the door leads straight to the graveyard, presents a unique set of geographic hazards. The physical layout of a country town is dangerous. In the city, there are blocks and buffer zones, but out in the rural communities, the lines between life, death, and immediate retribution are entirely too close for comfort. Places shape the drama, and sometimes the geography itself seems to conspire against a preacher. Take the old stories about Pastor Brad Smith. Long before he became a prominent voice in the denomination, he was pastoring a tiny traditional country church out in the dusty expanses of Texas. In those parts, the cemetery wasn't down the highway, it was right next door, separated from the sanctuary by nothing but a patch of weeds. Local custom dictated that the preacher lead the procession, walking backward or pacing slowly ahead of the pallbearers, reading comforting passages of scripture aloud as the congregation marched out to the burial plot. Now Smith was a man of focus. He had his Bible open, his eyes fixed on the holy page, and his voice echoing with pastoral authority as he led the solemn crowd through the grass. He was stepping backward, proclaiming, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures." He took one step back, then another. Before he could get to the valley of the shadow of death, he walked straight backward, right into the open, 6-foot deep grave. 1 minute his voice was booming across the Texas plains. The next, the congregation rushed to the edge of the pit, only to find their pastor staring up at them from the dirt, still holding his place in the book. It's hard to maintain the solemnity of a committal service when you have to fish the preacher out of the hole before you can lower the casket. But for sheer, unadulterated small-town drama, nothing matches a little place I ran a revival for, back in the hills and deep backwoods of East Kentucky. The geography of this particular town was painfully simple. Main Street was only about 3 blocks long. At the west end, the road split into a perfect Y right at the end of the street, and sitting smack dab in the middle of that fork was the Baptist church. At the opposite end of the 3-block stretch, right where it crossed the main highway, sat the local hotel. It was a perfect, unobstructed corridor of sight. If you stood on the hotel's porch, you were looking straight down the barrel of Main Street at the church doors. If you stood on the church steps, you were staring right back at the hotel. The man who owned the hotel passed away. To put it gently, the fellow was a sorry, low-down scalawag, and everybody in the county knew it. The Baptist pastor, a man possessing a rigid theological spine and absolutely zero filter, was called upon to preach the funeral. Now, some preachers will find a way to sugarcoat a rascal, but this brother decided that the pulpit was no place for fiction. He stood over that casket and painted a picture of the deceased exactly as he had lived. He didn't have a single good, redeeming thing to say about him, essentially preaching the hotel owner straight into the firing line of judgment, while the widow and daughter sat in the front pew, letting it fester. The next Sunday morning, the air in that valley was thick. At exactly 12 p.m., the church was letting out. The widow and the daughter were standing out on the hotel's porch, watching that 3 block stretch like hawks. The moment the heavy wooden church door swung open and the pastor stepped out onto the top step to shake hands with his flock, the 2 women commenced their march. They didn't run. They marched down the center of that 3-block street with the synchronized, terrible purpose of an invading army. The congregation watched from the churchyard as the 2 figures grew larger and larger. Before the poor preacher even realized he was under attack, those 2 mountain women converged on the front steps and proceeded to flog that pastor to a fare you well right there in front of the deacons. Between walking into open graves in Texas and getting publicly thrashed on the steps in Kentucky, I've learned that pastoring in the countryside requires 2 essential tools: a deep love for the scriptures and a very keen awareness of your immediate surroundings. The answer to the prayer line mystery. Back home in Piney Grove, we generally preferred to handle our disputes and misunderstandings through the proper channels, namely the Wednesday night prayer chain. If you've ever been on the church prayer line, you know it is a highly efficient information highway. Usually it's reserved for broken hips, upcoming surgeries, and traveling mercies. But now and then, a testimony comes through that explains a mystery that's been baffling the pews for weeks. Take the case of old brother Walter. Walter had been a fixture in the back left pew for 40 years, but lately his hearing had gone completely downhill. The congregation noticed he'd been nodding along to the sermons at all the wrong times, saying "Amen" right in the middle of a passage on the severe judgments of Egypt. Finally, admitting his ears were completely blocked up, he made the drive over to the county clinic. He sat down on the crinkly paper of the examination table and looked at the physician. "Doc," Walter said, leaning closely, "I'm having some terrible trouble hearing. The choir sounds like they're singing underwater, and I can't hear a word the preacher's saying unless he bellows." The doctor nodded with his usual professional patience. "All right, Walter, let's take a look and check this out." He clicked on his flashlight, pulled back on Walter's earlobe, and peered inside. The doctor blinked, adjusted his glasses, and leaned in closer. "Well, Walter," the doctor said, reaching for his medical trays, "there is definitely a foreign object lodged deep down in the canal here. Hold perfectly still." With the steady hand of a surgeon, the doctor slid a pair of long, silver tweezers into the ear, gripped down on something soft, and slowly pulled it out into the light. The doctor stared at the object in his hand, completely bewildered. "Walter, this is a suppository." Walter adjusted his glasses, leaned over, and squinted at the little waxy pill resting in the doctor's tweezers. The waiting room silence stretched for 3 seconds, while the gears in Walter's 90-year-old mind turned at maximum speed. Suddenly, his eyes went wide with a terrifying realization. He snapped his head up, looked at the doctor in sheer panic and blurted out, "Doc, can I use your office phone right this second? I've got to call my wife and tell her I finally figured out where I left my hearing aid." Needless to say, by 12:15 p.m., the Piney Grove prayer line wasn't asking for healing anymore. They were asking for a spirit of patience for poor Walter's wife, who had spent the last 24 hours wondering why her husband's morning medicine was whistling every time she walked past the nightstand. It just goes to show you, whether it's letters hidden in the altar, a Sunday school teacher taking a plunge, or a hearing aid misplaced in the most unimaginable way, these ridiculous, beautiful, overlapping lives hold Piney Grove together. We believe in the power of a joyful noise, even if it takes a pair of tweezers and a long-distance phone call to get the message through. Pastor Cones's Sunday school lesson, The Grace of a Good Laugh. Theme, the incongruent life. Finding God's joy in the things that just don't fit. Introduction, The Treasure in the Attic. There is a distinct difference between a family that merely shares a roof and a family that shares a history. The difference almost always boils down to the stories they choose to tell, remember, and rehearse. In a world that constantly demands we keep up appearances, our family stories, especially the messy, chaotic, and downright ridiculous ones, are among the greatest treasures we possess. They are the glue that holds our collective history together. Today we are looking at a specific spiritual discipline that isn't often listed in the traditional theological textbooks, but is essential for surviving the human experience with your faith intact. The ministry of humor. First, the theology of the incongruent. The great theologian and preacher Fred Craddock once noted that humor is, at its core, simply the incongruous, the juxtaposition of things that just do not fit together. We live in a world where we desperately try to make everything line up perfectly. We want our schedules tight, our church services orderly, and our lives predictable. But human nature is inherently clumsy, and when the polished surface of our expectations cracks, humor is the grace that fills the gap. Consider how easily our language betrays our best intentions. We've all heard well-meaning folks step up to a microphone and let the words get completely tangled up before they even hit the pews. The face shake. A speaker stands up, looks out at a crowded sanctuary, and warmly proclaims, "I see some faces out there I'd like to shake hands with." Mechanically speaking, you don't shake hands with a face. It doesn't fit. The truth precedent. Or consider the eager young youth minister who rushes up to the pulpit, clears his throat, and announces, "Now, church, I want to tell you something true before I preach." You have to wonder what exactly he expects to happen once the sermon officially begins. When these moments happen, we have two choices. We can become rigid and embarrassed, or we can embrace the beautiful, funny incongruity of being human. God made us with the capacity to laugh because He knew we would need a release valve for our own imperfections. Second, TikTok logic, prayers and pipe bombs. Nowhere is the importance of a clear-headed, humorous perspective more obvious than in a crisis. When things go wrong, human logic has a habit of scrambling under pressure, creating moments of absolute historic hilarity. Take a look back into the history of our own extended church family. One Sunday evening, the senior pastor was away, and the youth minister was left in charge of the evening service. Right in the middle of his sermon, a literal bomb threat was phoned into the church office. Odie Gressett, who was serving as the chairman of the ushers at the time, kept his composure. He walked with immense, solemn dignity up the aisle, mounted the steps to the pulpit, and handed the young minister a handwritten note. The note was brief and terrifying. "Bill, we've had a bomb threat come in." The young man read the note, paled slightly, and decided the best course of action was total transparency with the flock. He looked out at the congregation and explained exactly what was happening. Then, trying to balance pastoral duty with imminent danger, he suggested, "You know, I think we'll have a prayer right now, and then we'll all go outside." The logic was admirable, but the order of operations left a lot to be desired. Fortunately, the youth minister's wife, who many later noted was his saving grace and redeeming quality, was sitting in the front pew. Without missing a beat, she stood up and called out to the pulpit, "Let's go outside first and then have the prayer." When you think about the physics of an explosive device, her perspective made a whole lot more sense. But at that moment, the sheer ridiculous image of a congregation pausing to bow their heads and close their eyes while sitting on a hypothetical powder keg is exactly what Craddock meant by things that just don't fit. 3. Rehearsing the sacred and the silly. Why does this matter for us as a church family today? Humor defeats pride. It is impossible to hold on to a spirit of self-righteousness when you are actively remembering the time the Sunday school teacher fell in the baptistry, or the time the building fund urn was mistaken for Tommy Burns' final resting place. Humor builds resilience. Families and churches that can laugh together during a crisis are families and churches that stay together when the real storms hit. Humor allows us to look at a terrifying situation, like a bomb threat or a collapsing grave, and find the human warmth inside it. The power of the rehearsal. Scripture repeatedly commands God's people to rehearse their history, to tell their children what happened in the past. We usually think of this in terms of the parting of the Red Sea or the New Testament miracles, but we also need to rehearse our family comedies. Discussion questions for the family table. What is the single funniest, most incongruent thing that has ever happened during a family holiday or a church service in your memory? Why do you think God gave human beings the ability to laugh? How does humor serve as a form of spiritual relief? The next time our family or our church hits a moment of high tension or anxiety, how can we use the legacy of our funny stories to calm our hearts and remind ourselves that we are going to be okay? Closing prayer. Lord, thank you for the gift of the things that don't fit. Thank you for the grace to laugh at our own mistakes, our tangled words, and our scrambled logic in times of trouble. Keep our family stories alive in our mouths and in our hearts, and help us always to remember that your joy is our strength, even when that joy comes wrapped in a good long laugh. Amen. The Trash Can Symphony of Main Street. The physical layout of the property around Piney Grove Church was usually a blessing, but during the school year, it became a bit of a logistical test. The church sanctuary sat right down the street from the county junior high school, meaning that every afternoon at exactly 3:15 p.m., a tidal wave of youthful energy would wash right past our front steps. For the most part, Pastor Cohn didn't mind the noise. He loved the energy of the youth. But one September, a trio of 7th grade boys discovered a brand new, highly energetic way to express their after-school enthusiasm. Percussion. Every single afternoon, they would march down Main Street using heavy oak tree branches to beat a merry, deafening rhythm on every single metal trash can lined up at the curb. The crashing percussion rattled the windows of the church office, interrupted Pastor Cohn's sermon preparation, and generally shattered the peace of the entire block day after day. Knowing that a direct lecture from a preacher would only make the forbidden drum circle more appealing, Pastor Cohn decided it was time to deploy a bit of pastoral psychology. The executive producer. The next afternoon, the regular clack, clack, clack boom began echoing down the sidewalk. Instead of hiding behind his desk, Pastor Cohn walked right down the church steps and stood by the curb, intercepting the young percussionist mid-stride. The boys froze, raised sticks, expecting to get thoroughly chewed out by the minister. Instead, Pastor Cohn wore a wide, appreciative smile. "Boys, you kids are a lot of fun," Pastor Cohn said, nodding along to an invisible beat. "I absolutely love to see you express your exuberance like that. I used to do the same thing when I was your age down in Southeast Georgia. You've got real talent." The boys blinked, completely caught off guard. "Tell you what," Cohn continued, reaching into his pocket and pulling out 3 crisp $1 bills. "Will you fellows do me a massive favor? I get a real kick out of this. I'll give you each dollar right now if you promise to come around every single afternoon and do your thing on these cans." The boys were absolutely elated. They took the money, grinned from ear to ear, and did an absolute bang-up job on the trash cans for the rest of the week, feeling like professional musicians on the Piney Grove payroll. The budget cut. A few days later, the wily pastor walked out to meet them again as they drummed their way down the street. This time, however, his enthusiastic smile was replaced by a look of deep administrative concern. "Hold on a second, boys," Cohn said. holding up his hands to pause the symphony. He let out a heavy, dramatic sigh. I've got some tough news. The church budget is a little tight this week, and my own personal check hasn't quite stretched as far as I needed it to. Because of that, I won't be able to give you more than 25 cents each today. Will that be okay? The leader of the drum trio looked down at the shiny quarter in his palm, his face contorting into pure, unadulterated disgust. A lousy quarter? The boy exclaimed, tossing his oak branch into the grass. If you think we're going to waste our time and wear out our arms beating these old cans around for a quarter, mister, you're nuts. No way. We quit. The trio turned on their heels, crossed the street, and marched home in a huff, completely offended by the low wages. Pastor Cohn stood on the sidewalk, quietly pocketing his 75 cents, and watched them walk away. He turned back toward the church, climbed the steps, and enjoyed absolute peace, serenity, and holy silence for the rest of his days. The Great Sanctuary Time Trial. The business meeting at Piney Grove Church had been running for 2 hours, but the real trouble didn't start until item 4B on the agenda, the mounting of the new sanctuary clock. The clock itself was a generous donation from Mrs. Gladys Herring, purchased with green stamps and intended to replace the old mahogany one that had died mid-sermon 3 weeks prior. It was a beautiful, functional piece of equipment, but as Pastor Cohn quickly learned, deciding where a clock should live in a sanctuary is a matter of high-stakes diplomacy. I think it belongs squarely on the back wall, right above the double doors, announced Deacon Ledbetter, leaning forward on his pew. That way, the pastor can keep an eye on the hour and ensure we are out in time to beat the Methodists to Jack's restaurant. A murmur of agreement rippled through the back 3 rows. The noon rush at Jack's was no laughing matter. A 3-minute delay could mean the difference between a hot plate of fried chicken and waiting 45 minutes behind the Presbyterian choir. Now hold on a minute, countered Mrs. Gladys, her voice cutting through the sanctuary like a sharp breeze. I didn't buy a solid oak atomic clock so that it could look at the back of everyone's heads. It needs to go on the front wall, right next to the choir loft, so the congregation knows exactly how long we've been sitting here. Sam, sitting near the back with the young adult group, leaned over to Ian and whispered, if they put it in the front, Daniel is going to track his Sunday afternoon naps down to the millisecond. I am not, Daniel muttered back, but if it's in the front, we can time the invitations. If the final hymn takes more than 6 stanzas, we know the potluck potato salad is getting cold. The theological divide. Pastor Cohn stood at the pulpit, rubbing his temples. He had guided this church through building campaigns, youth retreats, and the great cracker crisis of 2022, when the communion supplier changed brands, but the great clock debate was proving to be his greatest theological challenge. Brethren, sisters, Pastor Cohn began, raising his hands for peace. Let's look at this logically. If we put the clock on the back wall, it looks like a timer is managing me. If we put it on the front wall, it looks like you're all counting down the minutes until you can escape my fellowship. It's about accountability, Pastor, called out Ben from the middle section. Last week you said in conclusion 4 separate times. By the 4th conclusion, my stomach was growling loud enough to be picked up by the pulpit microphone. That was a technical malfunction with the sound system, Ben. And you know it, Pastor Cohn replied with a wry smile. Why don't we put it on a swivel, Kalen suggested, trying to be helpful. We can mount it on the side pillar. Front row gets a profile view, back row gets a profile view, and if the sermon goes past 12:05, the usher can turn it toward the pulpit like a spotlight. The compromise. The debate raged on for another 30 minutes. Arguments were made for the balcony, the vestibule, and at one point, Deacon Ledbetter suggested mounting it directly inside the pulpit framework so only the pastor could see it, an idea Mrs. Gladys vetoed because it lacked aesthetic stewardship. Finally, Sam stood up. The room went quiet, curious to see what the younger generation had to offer to church tradition. Pastor, Sam said with total seriousness, I think we're looking at this all wrong. We don't need to choose between the front and back walls. We need to change the face of the clock. Change the face? Mrs. Gladys looked scandalized. It's an atomic clock, Sam. It sets itself by a radio signal from Colorado. Right, but hear me out, Sam continued, walking out into the aisle. Instead of numbers, we replace the 12, 1, 2, and 3 with milestones. Where the 11 should be, it says, almost done. Where the 12 is, it says, Jack's famous chicken. Where the 1 is, it says, Methodists have taken the booths. And if the hands ever hit the 2, a little mechanical deacon pops out and rings a dinner bell. The sanctuary erupted into laughter. Even Mrs. Gladys had to hide a smile behind her church bulletin. The verdict. In the end, a holy compromise was reached. The clock was mounted on the back wall above the double doors, exactly where Deacon Ledbetter wanted it, ensuring Pastor Thomas had a clear view of the passing time. However, to satisfy Mrs. Gladys and the congregation's need for transparency, the church youth group was commissioned to build a massive, decorative wooden frame around it. The next Sunday morning, as Pastor Cohn stood at the pulpit, he looked out across the congregation, then cast his eyes up to the new clock on the back wall. Encircling the beautiful oak timepiece was a hand-painted wooden banner, courtesy of Sam, Ian, and the boys. It read in beautiful, bold gold lettering, "To everything there is a season and a time to every purpose under heaven, but Jack's closes at 2 p.m. The day Reverend Cohn buried the wrong man. If there was one thing Piney Grove expected from a funeral, it was dignity. If there was one thing Reverend Cohn occasionally struggled to deliver, it was dignity. The trouble started on a rainy Thursday at the Piney Grove Funeral Home. 2 funerals were scheduled that day. One was for Harold Pruitt, a retired farmer known for growing the largest tomatoes in 3 counties. The other was for Clyde Red Johnson, a retired moonshiner known for growing things that were definitely not tomatoes. The funerals were only 2 hours apart. This fact would prove unfortunate. Eunice Pritchard, the receptionist, later claimed she saw disaster approaching like a tornado. Nobody listened. Reverend Cohn arrived carrying 2 funeral folders, one tucked under each arm, 1 pair of reading glasses, and absolutely no suspicion that he was about to become Piney Grove history. The chapel filled quickly. The family gathered. The casket rested beneath sprays of flowers. Hubcap, the grief dog, slept beneath the front pew. Everything appeared normal. The service began. Reverend Cohn stepped to the podium, cleared his throat, opened his folder, and launched into the most heartfelt eulogy of his career. Friends, we gather today to remember a man who spent decades outrunning revenuers and producing the finest moonshine in Jefferson County. The family looked confused, very confused. Harold Pruitt's widow blinked. Her son frowned. Her daughter whispered, "Daddy never made moonshine." The Reverend continued, "This dear man spent many nights hiding copper stills in the woods." More puzzled looks. His legendary white lightning was known from Birmingham to Chattanooga. Now the family was openly staring. Hubcap lifted his head. Even the dog sensed something was wrong, but Reverend Cohn kept going. He taught generations how to avoid federal agents. At this point, Harold's widow stood. "Reverend?" He smiled warmly. "Yes, Sister Pruitt." My Harold was a deacon. The room became very quiet. The Reverend froze, slowly lowered his notes, looked at the casket, looked at the family, looked back at his notes. His face turned the color of a ripe watermelon. Then Eunice, sitting in the back, buried her face in her hands. She knew exactly what had happened. The Reverend had picked up Red Johnson's funeral notes. The wrong man. The wrong funeral. The wrong criminal history. For several long seconds, nobody moved. Then old Billy Ray Possum Tucker stood up. "Well," he said, "that explains why I was wondering when Harold learned to outrun federal agents." The chapel erupted. Laughter rolled through the room. Even Mrs. Pruitt started laughing. Soon everyone was laughing except Reverend Cohn. He appeared ready to crawl inside the casket himself. Finally, he closed the folder, took a deep breath, and said, "Friends, after 40 years of preaching, I have discovered 2 important truths." The room quieted. "First, always verify your notes." A few chuckles. "Second, never trust folders that look exactly alike." More laughter. Then he added, "And third, if Harold Pruitt ever made moonshine, he successfully hid it from everybody." Even louder laughter. The Reverend found the correct folder. The service resumed. This time, Harold's actual accomplishments were celebrated. His farming, his church service, his kindness, his family. When the service ended, Mrs. Pruitt shook Reverend Cohn's hand. "I forgive you." "Thank you. But so that you know, Harold would have loved every minute of that." The Reverend sighed with relief. Unfortunately, his troubles weren't over. 2 hours later, he arrived for Red Johnson's funeral. This time, he checked the folder 5 times. Then he checked the name on the casket, then checked the name again. The family watched nervously. Finally, Red's brother asked, "Reverend, everything all right?" The preacher nodded. "I'm just making certain this is the moonshiner." The family burst out laughing. Years later, whenever anyone mentioned the Piney Grove funeral home, somebody would eventually bring up the day Reverend Cohn accidentally turned a deacon into a bootlegger. And whenever the story was told, Billy Ray Tucker always added, "You know, if you're going to preach the wrong funeral, at least make it interesting." Hubcap would wag his tail, and everyone agreed. It had been the most entertaining funeral Piney Grove had ever attended, except for perhaps the time Skeeter borrowed a corpse for a fishing trip. But that was a completely different story. The noon rush and the silent amen. Pastor Cohn was 20 minutes into a sermon on the patience of Job when he noticed that the response from the middle section of the Piney Grove sanctuary was unusually quiet. Granted, the thermometer outside Jack's restaurant across the street was pushing 98 degrees Fahrenheit, and the average age of the congregation on any given Sunday hovered somewhere around a ripe 74. Between the rhythmic clicking of the ceiling fans and the gentle, synchronous waving of the cardboard funeral home fans, Sunday mornings at Piney Grove often resembled a room full of people listening to a very soothing Waves of the Ocean tape. But then Pastor Cohn looked directly at Mr. Hubert Herring. Hubert was sitting in his usual spot, the third pew from the front, right under the air conditioning vent. His chin was resting firmly against his Sunday tie, his eyes were shut tight, and his arms were neatly folded across his linen jacket. This wasn't unusual. Hubert had slept through every sermon since the Carter administration. What was unusual was that Hubert's wife, Gladys, was vigorously nudging him with her elbow, and Hubert wasn't even flinching. Usually a third nudge resulted in a startled grunt. This time, nothing. Pastor Cohn gripped the edges of the wooden pulpit. He stopped mid-sentence, stepped around the microphone, and walked down the altar steps. He leaned over the pew, pressed 2 fingers to Hubert's wrist, and closed his eyes. When he looked back up at the congregation, his face was pale. "Friends," Pastor Cohn said, his voice dropping to a steady, heavy rumble, "I need everyone to remain perfectly calm. Sam, go out to the vestibule and call 911. Tell them we have an emergency in the sanctuary, and the rest of you, just bow your heads and pray." The arrival of the EMTs. Within 7 minutes, the siren of the Piney Grove Volunteer Fire and Rescue Unit was wailing down the main strip, drowning out the crickets. The heavy double doors of the sanctuary flew open, and 2 young EMTs, a tall, eager fellow named Gary and a rookie named Toby, burst into the room, hauling a heavy trauma jump kit and a collapsed gurney. The sanctuary was dead silent. True to Pastor Cohn's orders, the congregation had remained exactly where they were. Heads were bowed, eyes were closed, and bodies were slumped forward in deep, reverent intercession. Gary, clutching the defibrillator, stopped at the back aisle and scanned the room. "Where is the victim?" he shouted, his voice echoing off the exposed beam ceiling. Pastor Cohn, standing down front by the communion table, waved his arms. "Down here, 3rd row near the front." Gary and Toby took off down the carpeted aisle, their heavy boots thudding against the floorboards. But as they rushed down the rows, they were confronted with the unique reality of a Piney Grove Sunday morning, the search process. Gary spotted the first potential casualty in the back row. Deacon Ledbetter was leaning so far back into the corner of the pew that his head was completely touching the drywall, his mouth wide open, completely motionless. Gary dropped to one knee, putting his ear to the deacon's face. "Sir, can you hear me?" Deacon Ledbetter bolted upright with a loud snort, blinking wildly. "I'm awake, and the choir sounded beautiful." "Not him," Pastor Cohn called out from the pulpit area, sounding increasingly desperate. "Keep coming." Toby, the rookie, veered to the left, spotting Mrs. Elner in the 5th row. She was slumped sideways against the windowsill, her hand still holding a peppermint wrapper, her breathing entirely unnoticeable to the naked eye. Toby reached out and gently shook her shoulder. Ma'am, stay with me. Mrs. Elner opened one eye, looked at Toby's uniform and frowned. If you're here about my property taxes, young man, you can talk to my nephew after the invitation. Not her either, Pastor Cohn yelled, his hand over his eyes. Move forward. Gary took 3 more steps and lunged toward the 4th row, where Mr. Willard sat perfectly rigid, staring straight ahead into eternity without blinking. Gary gripped Willard's wrist. Sir, I need you to squeeze my hand. I'm praying, son, Willard muttered out of the side of his mouth, never moving a single muscle. And you're ruining my train of thought regarding the offering. By this time, Toby was sweating through his uniform. He looked at a 4th gentleman, old Mr. Coggins, who was slumped over the back of the pew in front of him, entirely unresponsive to the commotion. Toby pulled out his pen light and flicked it across Coggins' eyes. Coggins didn't move, but his wife sitting next to him batted Toby's hand away with her bulletin. Leave him be. He turned his hearing aid off during the children's sermon, and he won't be back until the potluck. The 5th man. Gentlemen, please! Pastor Cohn practically leaped into the aisle, pointing a trembling finger at the 3rd row. The 5th man, right here, Hubert! Gary and Toby finally converged on the correct pew. Gary checked Hubert's neck for a pulse, looked at Toby, and gave a solemn, quiet shake of his head. The congregation slowly began to sit up, the realization of what had happened passing through the pews like a quiet autumn wind. As Gary and Toby gently lifted Hubert onto the gurney, covering him with a crisp white sheet, a heavy, respectful solemnity filled the Piney Grove sanctuary. Pastor Cohn stood by Gladys, his arm around her shaking shoulders. Just as they reached the back double doors, Deacon Ledbetter stood up in the very back row, his voice clearing the thick silence. Well, the deacon said, his voice cracking slightly with emotion, but carrying a hint of true small-town grit. Hubert always did say he wanted to go out right after a good point, and he managed to skip the closing prayer in the parking lot traffic. A soft, tearful chuckle rippled through the older rows of the church. Pastor Cohn smiled through his tears, looking down at his notes on the pulpit. Let us dismiss, Pastor Cohn whispered, with a word of thanks for a race well run.